There's little doubt at this point that we're entering the worst crisis in a century of world capitalism, and in many ways, the crisis is worse than the 1930s. It's really difficult to underestimate the magnitude of this crisis, but we also need to be clear that coronavirus didn't cause the crisis. Rather, the virus was the trigger. Global capitalism was already in deep crisis, a multidimensional crisis. Here, I want to emphasize two dimensions. And one is the structural, that is a crisis of overaccumulation, and I'll go into a little more detail on that soon, or that is a crisis of stagnation. We want to remember that already by the end of 2019, much of Latin America and Africa had already entered into recession. The European Union and the United States was teetering on the verge of recession. Growth levels in Asia were significantly on the decline. Stock markets worldwide were teetering. Asset bubbles were very close, a number of asset bubbles, very close to bursting. There was a drop in commodity prices, and of course, the oil market completely collapsed. And in fact, since 2015, there's been a steady decline in worldwide industrial production and output. But the crisis is also very much political, one of state legitimacy and of capitalist hegemony. I think we can say that we are spiraling into a general crisis of capitalist rule. And the world capitalist system is entering into this period of chaos. We're stepping into the unknown here. The key point with the pandemic is that it aggravates tremendously, many times over, the crisis of global capitalism that we were already facing. This, for me, is a turning point. There's going to be no return to so-called normality. The pandemic has pulled back the curtain on the total failure of neoliberal capitalism, but I take it a step further and say the failure of global capitalism more generally. But we want to, when we look at the pandemic, emphasize its class character and also the devastating social consequences for the global working class and the majority of people around the world. You're all, I'm listening to this, probably familiar with the data. The organization, the International Labor Organization first reported that 200 million people will lose their job. And then a few weeks later, they increased that to say 1/2 of the world's workers are at risk. We know in the United States, 40 million people have lost their job, joining millions of others that already were unemployed. The ILO also reported that approximately that over 400 million small businesses could go out of business. Oxfam, for its part, reported that at least 500 million people are slipping now into poverty, joining the ranks of those that were already in poverty. And you're all familiar with the dramatic statement by the Food and Agricultural Organization that 30 million people face death by starvation. And then just a few days later, they changed that to say that we are facing hunger on a biblical scale. And the most vulnerable here are the 700 million transnational and internal migrants, refugees, those in war zones, those incarcerated, those in immigrant detention centers, and especially the urban poor in the world's mega cities. So the social consequences, the social impact is absolutely devastating. But we want to focus here on the strategy of what I call the transnational capitalist class, which is very clear, a classic case here of disaster capitalism. The strategy from above is to transfer the crisis, the cost of the crisis, and the sacrifices that it involves onto the backs of the global working class. You're all familiar with bailouts, but the figure is absolutely alarming. Just the United States and the European Union have already passed $8 trillion in bailouts in subsidies to capital, with scraps, little crumbs for workers and the poor. And the strategy here is a repetition, but on a much grander scale, of what happened with the financial collapse of 2008, in which the capitalist states are injecting this trillions of dollars into the banks and into corporations. And the banks have no obligation whatsoever to rechannel those funds to poor people, to the working class at all. In fact, what they did in 2008 and what we can expect now is that they're going to use those resources to snatch up assets all around the world. They're going to use them for further financial speculation. Millions of small businesses and medium-sized businesses are going bankrupt, even some big corporations, and those are all going to be snatched up and further concentrated. And the transnational capitalist class is going to turn this into a profit-making opportunity already. And you might have seen these reports that in just 3 weeks of the pandemic in the United States, the wealthiest groups increased their wealth by $240 billion. So we're going to see, we are seeing, and we're going to see as we move from beyond the health emergency into this deep crisis of capitalism, a much greater concentration and centralization of capital on a global scale. But I want to talk now a little bit more abstractly about what type of crisis we are facing here. I've been writing about the crisis of global capitalism since 2008, since that financial collapse. And we can identify three types of crises. One is the cyclical crises. These are the business cycle, and they occur approximately once every 10 years. There was a recession, a business crisis in the early 1980s, the early 1990s, then the turn into the 21st century. But the crisis we're in now is much more serious. It's what we call a structural crisis. Structural crises typically take place every 40 to 50 years or so. There was a big structural crisis worldwide in the 1870s, 1880s, another one, of course, in the 1930s, the Great Depression. The last structural crisis before 2008 was the crisis of the 1970s, which led us to capitalist globalization. And then we've moved into a new structural crisis in 2008. And with the pandemic, it's now accelerating many times over. So one reason we call it structural crisis, because these are what we can say are restructuring crises, meaning the only way to get out of a structural crisis is to restructure the way capitalism is functioning, how it's organized, its institutions, and so forth. So the structural crisis of the 1880s was resolved through a new round of colonialism and imperialism worldwide. The structural crisis of the 1930s was resolved through a new form of capitalism, which we can call New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism. The more technical term is Fordist Keynesian capitalism. Then we had this big structural crisis of the 1970s, and that was resolved. And when I say resolved, I mean for the capitalist system, not for the masses of humanity. That was resolved by capitalist globalization and the rise of a globally integrated production and financial system in which every country of the world has been progressively integrated into this globally integrated production and financial system. And we saw, since in the wake of the 1970s crisis, the rise of truly transnational capital and what I'm calling the transnational capitalist class, which might compete with local and national and regional capitals, but transnational capital has emerged over the last 4 decades as the hegemonic fraction of capital on a world scale, led by transnational finance capital, by the big banks and financial institutions. And now the transnational finance capital is fusing with the tech sector and with what we can call the global military industrial security complex. So from the 1980s, from this rise of capitalist globalization to 2008, we saw the globalization boom, an expansion of the global economy and an offensive of the transnational capitalist class. But since 2008, we've seen deepening stagnation. But I want to, before I go back to stagnation and to that structural dimension of the crisis, what I'm calling overaccumulation, I want to say that this, what we've seen also since 2008 in the face of the stagnation and the financial collapse is a new round of worldwide economic restructuring, worldwide capitalist restructuring. And now with the pandemic, that restructuring is already and is going to dramatically accelerate. And that is based on a much greater digitalization of the whole global capitalist system. Let's look at this for a moment. The capitalist globalization from the late 1970s and on was based, at least technologically, on the rise of computer and information technology and on the internet. And that allowed this restructuring worldwide. Now we are on the cusp of what's being called the fourth industrial revolution. driven by artificial intelligence and machine learning, and on the collection and the processing of data, what's been called big data, but also involving robotization, bio and nanotechnology, quantum and cloud computing, 3D printing, autonomous vehicles, and other new technologies, all wrapped around digitalization. And now this new round of profound restructuring, which again began about 10, 12 years ago, especially after the 2008 financial collapse, but is now going to tremendously accelerate, is based on a much more extensive and profound digitalization of the whole global economy, including, very importantly now, the digitalization of services worldwide, because we had, through digitalization and through capitalist globalization, we had the rise of globalized production and globalized finance. But now services are joining that, and here we can talk about platforms which are globalized, e-commerce, telework, telemedicine, remote learning, and so forth. And here's the key point. The pandemic and the types of things taking place now through the pandemic are going to dramatically accelerate this worldwide globalized digitalization, and especially services. And we've seen dramatically the rise of hypertrophy, gigantic, mammoth tech corporations that we're all familiar with. We're speaking on Zoom right now, Amazon, Facebook, Tencent, Alibaba, Apple, Microsoft. And so what we're seeing here, these tech companies already were moving over the last 10, 12 years, and the data is absolutely dramatic. I don't have any time to present it, how they've become so bloated and come to occupy the very core of the global capitalist economy. And these tech sector is as fusing, that is Silicon Valley is also fused with transnational finance capital and fused with the military industrial security complex. So these tech companies are flourishing during the pandemic, and they're going to emerge as even more powerful. And this block of capital that I just mentioned, Silicon Valley fused with transnational finance capital and the military industrial security complex, is really becoming the hegemonic block of capital at the very core of the post-pandemic paradigm, which is now becoming clear. And as I mentioned, we're going to see a vast new centralization and concentration of capital on a global scale. And it's hard to underestimate the influence and the control that this block of capital is now exercising, and even increasing its power over capitalist states. So one of the buzzwords right now, and this is especially in New York, some of you might have seen Mario Cuomo announce this great new initiative, which is and he's calling it, and this has been a buzzword now for several decades, public-private partnerships. Well, that's just a euphemism. A public-private partnership means that the state subsidizes capital, and the state privatizes and turns over to capital functions which were previously run by the state. And in this particular case, for instance, the case of New York, which is sort of a model now for what's going to be going on all over the world. Schooling, infrastructure, the functions of now geo-tracking around the virus, all of this now is involving state-private partnerships, which simply means that capital is going to acquire a much greater role over economy and society and over the state. So I mentioned that I want to look more closely now at the structural crisis of what I've been calling overaccumulation. And here we need to go into a little more detail into some political economic theory. And what we can call the most fundamental internal contradiction of capitalism is revolved around this overaccumulation, and more technically what we call the increasing organic composition of capital. And what I mean by that, what we mean by that in Marxist political economy, is that as capitalism develops, there's more and more fixed capital, more and more machinery, more and more technology relative to human labor involved in capitalist in the capitalist production process. And so the more and more you have machines and technology, then the less and less you have workers relative to that fixed capital, or what's technically called constant capital, you have the rate of profit tends to fall. And that's a problem for capitalists and for capital, which needs to maximize the rate of profit. So I'm going to use some technical terms here for those of you not so familiar with Marxist political economy, but we can say then that overaccumulation and stagnation, and we're going to see just how important that is to understand what's going on in global capitalism and in global society. But as we can say that this overaccumulation originates in the circus of production, with the introduction of more and more machinery and technology relative to human labor. But it is expressed, overaccumulation is expressed, we see it, we feel it in the sphere of circulation, that is in the market, or what we can call overproduction or underconsumption, meaning that the global economy has increasingly, through capitalist globalization, produced more and more wealth, more and more output in the global economy. Yet the global market is shrinking. The global market cannot absorb what the output of the global economy. This is part of the internal dynamics of how capitalism works. It generates, by its nature, capitalism generates increasing social polarization and inequality, rooted in what I had previously pointed out. So you're all familiar with this data. 1% of humanity now controls over 50% of the world's wealth. And more significantly, 20% of humanity controls 95% of the world's wealth. So that 20% represents those sectors of global society that can survive in one way or another in global capitalism and even flourish. But 80% of humanity is left with only 5% of the world's wealth. We've never seen these levels of inequality. This is simply unprecedented. And it means, once again, that the majority of humanity cannot consume. The more the global economy develops and can produce more and more wealth, the less the global market can absorb that wealth. And so that leads to stagnation. It leads to, and over the essence of overaccumulation is that capital has accumulated so much wealth, but it cannot profitably reinvest that wealth because of this stagnation. Now, here's the key point leading that to what's going on with digitalization and with the pandemic. So digitalization, and again, digitalization, the first round goes back to the 1980s with the introduction of computer and information technology, but it dramatically accelerates in the last 10 years since the crisis of 2008, 2009. And now with the pandemic, it's taking another qualitative leap forward, digitalization. And again, digitalization, to say that technically, involves a vast increase in the organic composition of capital, basically meaning that digitalized and fourth industrial revolution technologies excel in an increasing way, replaces human labor. So here's a piece of data just to give you an idea of this. In 1979, General Motors, and at one point General Motors was the biggest corporation in the world. And they said here in the United States, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States because it was so central to the US and then the global economy. So in 1979, which is the eve of moving into capitalist globalization and the introduction of computer information technology, had 1 million workers, General Motors, just a little less than 1 million workers, and generated in that year, 1979, $11 billion in revenues. Fast forward to 2012, Google has $14 billion in revenues, more than General Motors had, yet only 38,000 workers. So 1 million workers, 38,000 workers. And that was in 2012. This process dramatically accelerated in the last 8 years since 2012. And what's been happening, but there's been some resistance to this, and the pandemic decreases that resistance to this, is the rapid digitalization of all these different sectors. There's not a single sector of the global economy, not a single employment branch that is not affected by transferring from human labor to these new technologies. This includes the robotization of factories, of course, professions, even legal profession, medical profession, moving to become digitalized rather than human labor, industry, but even agriculture. Here in California, now there's an automatic a machine that picks and shakes the branches and gets the grapes, because there's a big wine production here in California, and then takes those grapes to a factory which processes them, no human labor. They now have a machine being introduced to pick strawberries. So even in labor-intensive areas like agriculture. And so theoretically, we can move, and we are pushing towards this laborless production, meaning this massive production of the global capitalist system with less and less and less workers through automation. So I mentioned then that this new round of worldwide structuring based on a more advanced digitalization and fourth industrial revolution technology is now vastly accelerated by the pandemic and by the aftermath as we move into the aftermath of the pandemic. And this is going to greatly increase social inequality and social polarization worldwide. It's going to dramatically increase the precariatization of labor, meaning that these technologies result in much less labor, but those that do remain as workers are de-skilled and also precariatized rather than regular fixed workers. So instead of taxi drivers, you have Uber workers. But it also dramatically increases surplus labor, what I call surplus humanity. That portion of humanity simply locked out of the global economy, no use to capital except holding wages down. And already 1/3 of humanity before this crisis was considered surplus humanity, locked out of the global economy. That's going to dramatically increase. So the whole face of the global economy and global society is going to be radically altered, and in a way which has tremendous implications, which when I, in a few minutes, move towards my conclusion, I'll refer to those implications. But first I want to say that this restructuring I'm talking about is actually going to intensify the contradictions of global capitalism, not resolve them. There's going to be ever greater stagnation. And as there's ever greater stagnation, the transnational capitalist class is desperate to find outlets to unload all of this surplus accumulated capital, outlets which will bring it profit. And so we can already see in the last 2 decades, maybe, since the early 21st century, accelerating from 2008, what have those outlets been? Because the outlet can't be 80% of humanity that doesn't consume. So especially financial speculation. And I've put forward in my recent writings this piece of data, that in 2018, the whole world GDP, the whole total production of goods and services worldwide was valued at $75 trillion. Right? Everything that human beings produce for goods and services. Yet financial speculation, just in derivatives, in 2018 was $1.2 quadrillion. So this is an enormous gap, unprecedented. We can't even wrap our minds around this gap between the real economy and what we call fictitious capital. Real economy, 75 trillion. Fictitious capital, just in derivatives, 1.2 quadrillion. So what happened that's financial speculation, to unload this surplus in the face of stagnation and overaccumulation. What happened in 2008 is that there were massive bailouts, not to the scale that we've seen now, much less, but there were massive bailouts. They were recycled. Those bailouts went to the banks, and the banks used all of that bailout money from 2008 to recycle it into even more financial speculation into the global economy, recycled it and used it to snatch up assets and resources all around the world, including land grabs, just to have land for speculation, for instance, which involved greater displacement of people from the countryside, more dispossession, more inequality, the aggravation of all of these contradictions, the structural, but also the political, economic, social contradictions of all of this. And now they have, just in the United States and the European Union, $8 trillion channeled into, as bailouts, into the coffers of banks and corporations. The second outlet for this surplus accumulated capital up until 2020, has been debt-driven growth, meaning that consumer debt worldwide is at an all-time high. Corporate debt is at an all-time high, and state debt, government debt, sovereign debt is at an all-time high worldwide. You go into incredible debt to continue to consume, push the global economy forward, but that debt reaches a breaking point and everything collapses. And right before the pandemic, debt levels globally, total corporate, consumer, and state debt was approaching $300 trillion. And then, so that's a second outlet for this surplus accumulated capital to stave off the collapse. that was coming anyway, and the pandemic finally triggered. The third outlet, and this is critically important because it involves politics and the struggle now during and post-pandemic, the struggle from below of the global working class, has what I've been calling militarized accumulation. And here we have very clearly the link between global economics and global politics, in the sense that how do you continue to making profit in the face of stagnation and the shrinkage of the global market? Well, you fan wars, you fan and encourage conflicts and political tensions and systems of transnational social control and repression. And you do that, of course, to contain global surplus humanity and the global working class. But the point I'm making here is you do that because it's incredibly profitable. Rounds of destruction and reconstruction and conflicts and repression and locking up immigrants and so forth and so on are incredibly profitable, and it allows for an unloading of surplus accumulated capital and profit making when you can't do it by other means. So that takes me, and I will soon be concluding, but there's one other theoretical point here, theoretical and political point we need to explore. And it is this, then this leads me, what I previously said, to my concept of the global police state, and the title of my new book. And it was originally scheduled to be released in July, just very soon, another few weeks from now, but because of the pandemic, they pushed it back to September. So that will be out in September. But what I mean by the global police state are three things, that concept. First is militarized accumulation, as I just mentioned, that systems of transnational social control and repression, making wars, fanning conflicts, etc. All of that is a source of accumulation of capital and profit making, independent of political or geopolitical objectives. Secondly, what I mean by global police state is the vast expansion of these new systems of transnational social control and repression. And third, what I mean by that is the rise of neo-fascist or 21st century fascist political systems, authoritarian and neo-fascist systems. The three of them combined with the concept of global police state helps us understand those three and how they are linked to capitalism and the crisis of capitalism. So what happens with the pandemic now is that the pandemic is generating this current crisis, vastly expanding the need that dominant groups have for social control and repression. When you have hundreds of millions thrown into unemployment, when you have hundreds of millions facing starvation, the mass displacement going on, the ruling groups need more than ever to expand these systems of social control and repression. So the pandemic is going to intensify that dimension of global police state. But secondly, and this is clear and this is important to see, the pandemic is expanding that second dimension of global police state, meaning it's opening up new opportunities for accumulation through social control, and I'll get to that in just one moment. And third, the pandemic is also creating fertile new conditions for neo-fascist forces to mobilize. So we're facing, and let me just give you an example, by the way, of that. The global surveillance state has been coming about for quite a number of years now, but with the pandemic, you have the vast expansion of tracking technologies. You have the vast expansion of these online platforms. We're speaking right now on Zoom, right? And so forth. And so the ability to carry out social control and repression is greatly intensified through the pandemic. But for me, what's so alarming here, what we need to focus on is the grave threat now of 21st century fascism. I know that Mutiny and Neil and Phil have been talking about creeping fascism. That's a great term. We're thinking along the same lines, but now it's even not so creeping. It's really leaping forward. I've been writing about the threat of 21st century fascism for the last 12 years. I started looking at this systematically in 2008. And for me, fascism, whether it's 20th century variety or it's 21st century variety, fascism is always a particular response to capitalist crisis. And it is a response which, among other things, rests on having to construct a mass social base. And the basis of fascism building a social base is, in times of crisis, promising to restore order and security in times of crisis. And it is a response to the severe mass social anxiety and insecurity and destabilization that crises generate from masses of people, masses of poor working class people, and those disruptions. Now, the difference between, and this we can debate, I know there's a lot of debate about this, but the difference between early 20th century fascism, because there's many similarities, but a key difference is the early 20th century fascism was, its mass social base was the petty bourgeoisie. Those, small business owners, et cetera, that were being displaced and facing insecurity as a result of capitalist development. Now, in this 21st century, the mass potential and real base of 21st century fascism is sectors of the global working class. But which sectors in particular? Those sectors that were formerly privileged, such as white male state workers and stable employment with high incomes in the first world, in the cores of world capitalism. And these formerly privileged sectors of the global working class have been destabilized and have been facing increasing insecurity as a result of capitalist globalization, restructuring, precariatization, rising surplus labor, everything we've spoken about. And so you see with 21st century fascism, the drive to capture that mass social base, involving, of course, the same as 20th century fascism, a racist mobilization against scapegoats, extreme masculinization, because that masculinization is tied to the discipline of capital's ability to discipline, martial ideologies, that is increased militarism, millennialism. Now in the United States, this millennialism is taking many forms, including these doomsday groups that say doomsday is coming, and survivalist strategies. And I want to analyze here, because now this is important to understand the dangers we face now, and the danger again is intensified many times over by the pandemic. That for me, fascism, and in this case 21st century fascism, involves a triangulation of three things. One is reactionary and repressive political power in the state. And I'm going to take the example, as I discuss this now, of the United States. But this fascism is rising around the world, in Europe, in India, in Israel, and elsewhere. So you have with Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party, and the right wing of the Republican Party is one extreme right, bordering on a fascist right, and it's the one that has control over the Republican Party. And so you have these fascist forces having a hold over the US state. We don't have fascism yet in the US. We're on the verge of that threat. The second part of this triangulation, in addition to reactionary and repressive state, second is that fuses with transnational capital. Now, I have to say something, and we can debate this when we move in just a few minutes towards discussion, but there's a lot of confusion that Trump is a populist, and that Trump represents national capital. That's simply not true. The empirical evidence doesn't suggest anything of the sort. The transnational capitalist class might not like some of the political programs and agree with all of Trump and his being a buffoon and so forth, but they love his economic program. He's done everything for transnational capital, from regressive taxation to massive subsidies for capital to deregulation to assaults on unions and workers and so forth. So that's the second plank. Again, this is a triangulation when we try to understand 21st century fascism. The third part of that triangle is a fascist mobilization in civil society. If you don't have that, what you might have is authoritarianism or dictatorship, but not what we understand as fascism. Fascism has to secure a mass base in civil society. And of course, the Nazis did that. I'll have a little more to say about that and how we can understand 2020. But here in the United States, to go back to that example, you see a dramatic fascist mobilization in civil society, intensified first when Trump came to power in 2016-17, but now intensifying much more with the pandemic. So you have right-wing armed militias, you have the white nationalists, the Nazis, the Klan, the anti-immigrant movement, the people that have now resurrected the Tea Party in a new form, the Patriot Movement. Some of you or many of you will be familiar with this. So this incredible mobilization in civil society of a real and a potential base for for fascism. And I want to say that those right-wing militias have already fused with the Republican Party at the local level all over the country. And Trump is fanning that right-wing, that fascist armed mobilization. So you see these things coming together crystal clear here in the US, this project of 21st century fascism. And what the key point is, because we're talking about the pandemic, is the conditions of the pandemic are accelerating this process. The anti-lockdown protests that you are in the UK and around the world might be familiar with what's been going on here, involves those far-right armed militias linking up with Trump and with the right wing of the Republican Party. And it's not just that. Also, part of this switch of this dangerous move towards fascism is ordering workers back to work. But we've never seen that, where you are ordered by presidential decree back into work under extremely dangerous conditions. And the campaign against immigrants was always extremely repressive. Obama was the deportation president. He deported more people than Trump deported. But the way the anti-immigrant campaign is now unfolding is truly fascist. I mean, these detention camps for the immigrants is the equivalent of Nazi concentration camps and so forth. So here's the thing to conclude this point, that as the pandemic intensifies inequality, mass unemployment, mass suffering, this heightens the need that the ruling groups have for social control and repression to keep a lid on the mass explosions that are coming. And so that means that the transnational capitalist class, because some of you may say, and rightly so, well, not all groups of capitalists agree with fascism. They might love Trump's economic policies, neoliberalism, capitalist globalization, assaults on workers' power, but they don't want fascism. But when you have this incredibly intensified need for mass social control and repression and containment of the global working class, you might see, and we will see, the move towards many groups within the transnational capitalist class to embrace 21st century fascism. Now, I mentioned, I'll go back to the Nazis. Let's remember what happened. The German capitalist class in the 1930s did not want anything to do with the Nazis. They were anti-Nazi. But eventually, given the crisis of capitalist crisis in Germany, capitalists started to embrace the Nazis because they were going to crush the socialists and the working class and any opponents, but also because the Nazis then created all of these accumulation and profit-making opportunities and ideal conditions for capital. So then you got that fusion. So let's remember after 2001, the events of 2001, governments all over the world passed these draconian so-called anti-terrorism laws, which allowed them to tremendously increase repression and control and surveillance. And now in the pandemic in 2020, governments have decreed national emergencies, ruling by decree. We see that here in the United States. We see it in Hungary with Orbán, an extreme example of ruled by decree. So all of these things, and I'm going to conclude now. I got one more thing to say. By way of conclusion, two other points. These things are happening so quickly. It's really hard to keep up with the analysis. I start analyzing some of this. I write an article, but I'm sure the same with many of you. A day or two later, things have developed so quickly, we can barely wrap our mind around how to analyze all of this. But I think now this is going to get to the heart of how we can understand the post-pandemic situation emerging in terms of the global political economy, that there has been already a restructuring of space. And now this is going to intensify as a function of that inequality and polarization, and also as a function of accumulation. And this is going to is already taking place in the global megacities, the urban poor and the global megacities. They're sites of where the global police state beats down on the population, and they are the sites of the battle for the future. Before the pandemic, I had been speaking about the restructuring of space by using the metaphor of green zones and gray zones. Because when the US invaded, in 2003, invaded and occupied Iraq, they set up in the center of Baghdad the green zone, which was impenetrable. It was protected by the US military, by the new Iraqi military, and in there was the US occupation forces in the green zone, but also the new Iraqi elite and middle and professional and privileged strata. And they were protected from this mayhem and destruction that engulfed the whole rest of Baghdad and the whole country. So the idea is the green zone is where the global wealthy and the powerful are residing, and the gray zone is that mass of humanity, especially in the global megacities, which are subject to global police state, and there's spatial restructuring to separate them physically, and there's policing on one side, and there's internet and services on the other side. But here's the thing. This and so that's one metaphor. I don't have time here to go into this fundamental spatial restructuring that has been taking place worldwide. But here's the thing that now goes with the pandemic to a whole new level. And I want to make this analytical point really clear because it's so important, that the pandemic and the types of technologies now occupying the very center of what's going on with the pandemic involves now spatial restructuring through virtual space. And the lockdowns are a dry run for controlling and restricting the circulation of labor and of surplus labor, channeled through virtual space. So this is a little technical for those of you who are not familiar with the political economy. Idea here, though, is that there's more tighter controlling of the distribution of labor power. Human beings, in other words, their actual circulation, their actual movement is going to be more and more tightly controlled, but not so much through lockdowns, through forced lockdowns. Those will be lifted. But the outcome of this is going to be a virtualized control of space in a way which there's much more tighter control of the circulation of labor, with dramatic political implications and implications for resistance. So you're both controlling the movement of labor, and you're turning labor into virtual labor more and more. So what have we seen with the lockdowns? All around the world, the lockdowns might have been necessary to respond to the health emergency. But at the same time, they are creating the conditions for this more tighter control of the global working class. And also these lockdowns around the world have been enforced through repression. All of you have seen, if you're watching the television screens, how in India, the mass repression of the 200 million migrants who are trying to walk home, 150, 200 kilometers. You've seen in South Africa, the police and army deployed to the streets and literally beating people who don't lock themselves into the house. But you also see this, for instance, in Central America, 30 to 40,000 people have been detained, put in jails because they violated a lockdown. Why? Because they have to go out to the streets or they starve to death. You've seen that here in the United States. So what's going on with the quarantines besides the repressive enforcement of those quarantines and the states of emergency that have been decreed? You have quarantines disaggregating labor further, meaning we're speaking here virtually, but social, political, workers' movements are going to be more and more disaggregated through this virtual space. And you are also going to have, through this restructuring accelerated by the pandemic, vastly expansion of cognitive proletarianization. That is the precaritization of a cognitive proletariat controlled through virtual space. And what that means is, to use a technical sociological term, a dispersal of subjectivities even more, meaning if we want to change the world and work together and organize, we need to come together physically about that, but also in terms of our subjective understanding and discussion and so forth. But the transformations, this restructuring which is now accelerated, further disperses subjectivities, and it also further locks out surplus labor. Okay. So emerging from the health emergency, we are going to have mass employment. We already have unemployment. We already have it. But many of those that have been newly made unemployed will not be reabsorbed into the global workforce. And you're going to have that mass unemployment allowing for intensified super exploitation of those that do get their jobs back or still work. And just a preview, for instance, in the United States of what we've seen of that, is that the meat packing workers, meat processing, meat packing, and the majority are immigrant workers, have been forced back to work under extremely onerous conditions. But more than that, there's been a speed up. Trump said, since this is an essential service, we can speed it up. In other words, how many cows you can slaughter or chickens you can slaughter, the amount was regulated. Now they have no regulation. They can slaughter as many. So there's work speed ups and all other kinds of ways of super exploiting workers. Agricultural workers, also immigrants. Agricultural workers already receive starvation wages here in the United States. Trump decreed that the agricultural output is essential, and therefore lowered their wages, their official wages. lowered it. So you see this intensified super exploitation is going to be all around the world because of mass unemployment. And secondly, mass unemployment will allow the transnational capitalist class and capitalist states to heighten discipline over the global working class and to disconnect surplus labor from social reproduction spending. We are going to see the attempts at a new round of social austerity, privatization, deregulation, in sum, an all-out assault on the global working class. So I would be remiss if, by way of conclusion, I didn't say something politically about our struggles from below. So I will conclude with this. The struggle for a post-COVID-19 world has already begun. And we've seen in recent years a political polarization worldwide between insurgent popular forces, social movements, and the left, on the one hand, especially after 2008, and an insurgent of far-right reactionary forces and neo-fascist forces. And the latter, the neo-fascist forces, have been gaining space more rapidly, I would say, than us on the left. And so let's remember that restructuring crises, which we're in, are times of rapid social change. And in times of rapid social change, human agency may play a more prominent role relative to structure. You know, we always say there's a structure which structure plays a role and agency plays a role, but agency can do more during times of crisis. And these are times that are incredibly unpredictable and things can go in many different directions. And also structural crises can move to systemic crises. Systemic crisis is a third type of crisis, meaning the only way out of that crisis is to overthrow the system itself. And so if a structural crisis such as we're in now moves towards a systemic crisis, and how it unfolds depends on a whole host of political and subjective factors, which cannot be predicted beforehand and which we are involved in generating, those political and subjective factors. So the struggle against the depredations of global capitalism that we've all been involved in is now conjoined with the struggles against the fallout from the pandemic and shaping the direction of the post-pandemic world. Let's remember that periods of intense social and class struggle, which is upon us now, coincide with periods of capitalist crisis, such as the 1930s, the 1960s and 70s, 2008, and now we're on the eve of a massive new round of class and social struggle worldwide. The pandemic has the potential to wake up millions of people from political apathy. It's crucial at this time, therefore, to wage and intensify ideological struggle, counter-hegemonic struggle, to take advantage of the fact that the pandemic reveals the incapacity of capitalist states to manage this crisis. Remember that in fall 2019, right on the eve of the pandemic, there were mass mobilizations all around the world, and they were linking up with one another. They were understood each other. From France, the yellow vests and everything else going on in France, from Lebanon to Chile to Haiti to Iraq to Hong Kong to the United States. 2017 to 2019 saw the biggest strike wave in the United States since the 1970s. And the pandemic momentarily pushed people off the streets, but that will change. It already is changing. And the ruling groups fear this growing discontent, this growing volcano from below, which is why they will intensify the global police state at this time. So our strategy, and I conclude with this, and this is my contribution to our political discussion about what to do, what is to be done, is that we have to establish now a favorable correlation of forces emerging from the health emergency. And that involves especially marginalizing the fascist response to the crisis and preventing a restoration of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is bankrupt. It can't resolve the crisis. It's moribund, but it's not dead. And so our platform of struggle, I suggest, should involve two key aspects. One is demanding and struggling for massive bailouts for the global working class, including formal and informal workers. And secondly, building a united front against fascism. And these two planks of our platform go together very closely because the would-be social base of a fascist project is those millions of people that have been displaced by the crisis and are suffering struggles of survival because of the crisis. And so we want that to be our social base. So these two planks of our struggle, massive bailouts for the global working class, united fronts against fascism, they really go together. They're complementary to each other. So I will stop there.